Okay, welcome back to lecture one. Now we're into part three of Truth, the Masterclass. Why metaphysics is central. So we had discussed in part two the different methods of truth seeking, one of which was philosophy, and philosophy is just such a broad category, but it essentially means that we are actually taking the time to think about the methods of thought. We're thinking about, everything and anything without any kind of assumptions, which is obviously very, very valuable when it comes to truth seeking because, as we also discussed in part two, there are methods of truth seeking that are integral to our experience as human beings. In other words, we are biased in certain ways, and we very rarely take the time to think about those biases and how they may be clouding our judgment insofar as arriving at truth in a very clear and absolute sense. That being said, narrowing down philosophy a little bit further, the core of the philosophical activity that can help us arrive at such an absolute truth is metaphysics. And the reason for that is because, as I very quickly mentioned as well, everything reduces to the question of existence. Why is there something rather than nothing? What is existence? How does it work? Being. And so metaphysics quite literally means beyond physics. And it's a very interesting thing because we start to already run into a bit of a paradox. I mean, what does it mean for us to go beyond physics? I mean, it can be paradoxical if you're thinking about things in a very empirical sense. And by empirical, I'm talking about physical senses, not spiritual sense or consciousness. But ultimately, everything we have, like experience, is physics. It's physical. It's an experience set in some kind of framework in a certain level of, it's rooted in a certain amount of dimensions. So meta, meaning beyond or after. Beyond that, what does that mean? What is beyond? Is it nothingness, void? Is it another kind of reality that is non-physical, whatever that could mean, such as possibility spaces has been put forward by a professor named George Ellis, for example, and, other kind of abstract conceptualizations of realities. Metaphysics is basically not necessarily something that is in a camp, meaning it is spiritual or beyond physics. It just means it is pointing to the fact that in order to understand the direct basic experience or world that we have around us, you require to step outside of it somehow or beyond it in order to look in. And so there's a reconstituted quote from, I believe it was Hegel, that says that, a limit implies that which is beyond it. So what is at the limit of existence, of physics? If there's a limit, I mean, there seems to be some kind of limit. And even if there was no limits, the limitless nature of existence or physics, if it's ongoing, is that itself a limitation? Is another question we could look into. Without devolving too much into the abstracts here, because again, this is still an introduction, it's just to show you that metaphysics as a practice, as a philosophical endeavor, it is the study of first principles. What is primary? What is fundamental? And I think that the thought exercise that I've just run through gives us a good idea as to why first principles are required for us to understand what reality is, precisely because of this idea of limits, and the need to define something requires limitation or boundaries or contrast of some sort. So when we're talking about existence itself, what is that? What provides that contrast? Well, void, nothingness. Or if you subscribe to the idea that there is no such thing as void, which most people do nowadays, then you default to infinity as a concept, meaning that there is no end to existence in this fashion of limits. So if there's no limit and it is infinite, what does infinity mean? And is that a first principle? And if it is, how does that give rise to the definition for truth? So this is what we're doing. We're trying to study the first principles. Are there several? Is there just one? If the search for truth reduces to a unitary, single kind of thing, then by definition, there is only one principle, but that principle needs to be defined, and so it devolves into dualities, and that's more stuff that's coming up that I need to explain a little bit later, but hopefully you're getting an intuitive grasp. I've written here, however, it is misleading as first implies a hierarchy, as if some are more fundamental than others, when on the level of describing ultimate reality, things are more lateral. So this is diving into a little bit more of the point of view that I have here. And again, getting away from subjectivity is always very difficult, perhaps impossible, but I do think that logic, which is something we can share to arrive at an objective consensus, does conclude with the fact that a first principle isn't actually first, and that although we have to understand reality through multiple components, those components would be lateral, meaning that there's no such thing as a hierarchy there. So I'm starting to massage it a little bit further. Still very abstract. At the end of the day, as long as we understand that metaphysics is central because it is the core activity of trying to understand and come to understanding how we can understand. So I've written here some bullet points: philosophy as the interdisciplinary field of study, metaphysics as the core, so that's self-explanatory. Beyond physics, not reality limits, the implications of limits, so we've covered that. The study of the limits of physics and consciousness. So this is where I can start to lay out the argument as to why we require void, at least as a concept, not necessarily something that has to be proven, because of course it's extremely paradoxical. By definition, void doesn't exist, it is void. Therefore, you can just put it to the side and ignore it, which I believe is an error. And there's a reason for why nothingness has been so central to metaphysics since the beginning of time. One of the simple ways to put it is that, in order to come to a definition, you require contrast. And how can you contrast existence without the concept of void? I don't know. And even if, and I do believe we do, and kind of arrive at a truth that is so fundamental that it surpasses there being any need to prove and or disprove void and or existence as a physical thing. I think that there's something more fundamental that we can arrive at. However, to arrive at it, we can't assume that anything is off the table, including void and nothingness. So that is the argument that I make. Again, the point of arriving at a unitary truth requires us to arrive at it through a certain level of logic that can enable us to have an objective consensus. So it's not just my subjective point of view. I do believe, as rare as it is as a metaphysical standpoint, it's not necessarily one that is incorrect. And in fact, I argue why it is the objective correct one to use insofar as we can arrive at truth. So I've also written here qualia, quantity, definition, and meaning. Still, we're going through a lot of different things here as an introduction. However, massaging it further, qualia has a certain history in philosophy insofar as what we use it to mean. It isn't exactly qualities, like kind of like an adverb in language, right? It is. But to keep it simple, let's think about it that way. Let's think about it as a quality. Let's think about it as phenomenologically, qualia is let's call it something that can be identified, right? It is like a label almost. It's an identification. So keeping it abstract, and of course, we can always debate these things as well, but this is how I'm approaching it. Qualia is a certain label that helps identify. What we identify is another question. However, quantity is a little bit more self-explanatory, and that is what comes next. It's very clearly the idea that there are more than one things. So if there's, if there is components or a certain variety of things, we call that quantity. But really what we're going to be discussing is the relationship between quantities, meaning what is the relationship between 1 and 2 things, and 2 and 3, and so on ad infinitum. The relationship between numbers. This is something that is extremely relevant, and we're going to arrive at that, and you'll understand why later on in the presentation. However, quantity in the context that I will be employing it here is something to be understood as the study we call mereology. Mereology is the study of wholes and parts. So it's a little bit different than numbers insofar as there are many objects and or concepts that we're observing. It is the study of the relationship any one thing has to itself. So very similar to quantity, because we're talking about relationship, which implies there to be components or dualities, meaning a chair has several parts to it, but it has its own integrity as one thing as well. And what does that mean? So that is the study of mirology, which can also just be reduced to the idea of quantity, but that distinction is very important to make. So definition, meaning, these are all things that we're going to have to look at through our metaphysics to then arrive at truth. Epistemology and its relevance is another one, perhaps the most important one, which is just the idea of how do we know what we've arrived at. I already am talking about qualia, mirology, metaphysics. Now, how do I know and how do I arrive at knowing that I know that metaphysics is central? And everything that I've said up to now, I started with, what was part one, why we seek truth. Is this the correct entry point into the search for truth, to understand why first that we're doing it? I think it's a good way to contextualize it, but it may not be important. Maybe we could have started with the methods of truth seeking, and the why is something that becomes answered as an emergent phenomenon after we dive into the metaphysics, right? Doesn't really matter. The point is, um, we're going to need some level of ground for justification. And that's what epistemology is all about, is the study of knowledge itself. Is it knowledge? And what does it mean? Is knowledge the same thing as truth? There's all these questions, and this is the big, hairy elephant in the room that is very, very difficult to pin down, perhaps impossible, but I don't actually think it has to be a problem, because moving forward with the analogy that I'm using here, the problem isn't the elephant, it's the room. I think, the elephant is there roaming around in the environment that it is natural to, the savanna, and we're the ones who are seeing an elephant inside of a room that isn't actually there. We require stepping outside of the room to just observe the elephant in its natural environment. So for all intents and purposes, that metaphor goes to say that epistemology might actually just be a rabbit hole that we're falling into, and then that it is unnecessary, that there's a way to bypass it. At least bypass the errors or problems that we arrive at when we go down that rabbit hole, talking about elephants and rabbits here. So recapping everything, assuming nothing to arrive at certainty of what truth is, what it means, how it is obtained, and whether it is absolute and undoubtedly justifiable. This is why metaphysics is central, essentially, is because we are taking every single concept and or experience possible, including ones that maybe we can never actually have, which is an interesting concept. But that which we don't know, that idea is even something that we want to incorporate and use, because the more inclusive and ecumenical we can be, the higher likelihood that we arrive at truth. If there are remainders, if there are loose threads here and there that we can pull on, then it's very easy to disprove our statement and claim that we've arrived at a singular absolute truth, right? So that naturally means that we have to include everything. And including everything, is that possible? If so, how is it possible? This is the kind of things we're going to dive in to in this lecture series, using concepts like infinity and other things. So there it is. Metaphysics is central because it doesn't make any assumptions. I mean, you are completely open and free, and in fact, by necessity, using an exploration of everything that you possibly can, so that you're not risking pigeonholing yourself. So there it is. Maybe the last thing to do before ending this part is to look at the quote here. Did you know that you hold a metaphysical assumption? This kind of ties back into part 2 as well, the method of truth seeking. Your method also comes with a certain assumption, right? The assumption that your method is correct to begin with, but also within each method, so in the scientific worldviews that we have, there are multiple kind of metaphysical assumptions that we make, right? Some people do think that scientific atheism or material reductionism has the shared consensus that everything is material, but the different assumptions of what that means can differ between material reductionists, right? What is material could be frequency or quantum particles, whereas others would say it's information. So the substrate of material itself can have different assumptions. And so Either way, you do hold a metaphysical assumption. It is impossible not to hold one. The way that you live your life ultimately kind of gets determined at the outset by your metaphysical assumption. So it is important to know which one you do hold and to see the limitations that imposes onto you. That being said, I think you should take time to examine that for yourself. Into part 4.